Okay, we're continuing our journey through learning ways to solve quadratic equations, and there's lots of different techniques because quadratic equations frequently show themselves in different ways, different formats, and so we're learning to handle different things. We've already looked at taking square roots. Okay, we had a previous video on that one. So this time we're going to be looking at how to solve a quadratic equation by factoring. So I'm going to start you out looking at this one, and what we're going to do to solve this by factoring is we're going to try to write it in this format. Okay, and you may remember the technique we used on this. First of all, we knew that this had to be an x and that had to be an x because when I multiply these together, I get x squared. You might be remembering that we can use the simpler technique of this because this is just a 1 right here. It's not any other number. So since it's 1x squared, we can use this simpler technique. And then we're going to look at these two numbers here. They have to multiply together to get 28. So we're going to get all the factor pairs of 28. There they are. And we're going to pick one of those pairs based on this criteria. That tells me that the two numbers either, they're going to be the same sign, either two negatives or two positives, but they have to add together to get 11. So that'd be 4 and 7. So I'm going to write those numbers here, 4 and 7. And the last thing we're going to do is decide whether or not they should be both plus or both minus. Well, the only way for them to add together to get negative 11 when we FOIL this is for both of them to be negative. So negative 4 plus negative 7 is negative 11. And negative 4 times negative 7 is positive 28. So we're good to go. Now what I want you to look at is this. I'm going to highlight that one in green and this one in blue. Okay? And I want you to notice that the green thing times the blue thing is going to equal 0. Okay? And we've talked about this before. The only way for two things to be multiplied together to get 0 is if one of them's 0. Okay? So I want to ask you this kind of question here. If the green thing is 0, what does that mean x has to be? Okay? I'll say it again. If the green thing is 0, then what does x have to be? Well, the only way to get 0 out of this would be for x to equal 4, because 4 minus 4 gets you 0. Well, what if the blue thing is 0? Okay? That means that the only way for that to happen is x would have to equal 7. So what you've found now is the two solutions to the original quadratic equation by factoring it. Okay? So I want you to look at a few more. Okay? So this one is set to go, except, they're not going to get 0. So we need to fix that first. And what we'll do is we'll add 2 to each side in order to make this 0. It wasn't 0, so I decided to make it 0. And of course I added 2 to 30 because that's the only one without any x's or x squared. Okay, so now I have this equation. We know this is going to be x, that's going to be x, and the two numbers that we're looking for have to multiply together to get 32. So let me just crank those out here. Okay, that's all of them. Okay, and I'm looking for a pair that adds together to get 12. That'd be 4 and 8. So I'll use 4 and 8. The whole thing equals 0 still. And then should they both be positive or both be negative? Well, if they're adding together to get negative 12, they're both going to have to be negative. Okay. Now, using the same idea before, now we know that x is 4 or 8. Okay. If you put 4 in here, this becomes 0. If you put 8 in there, that becomes 0. So there's our solution. Okay, so what we're doing is looking at each of these equations and first of all making sure that the right side is 0, okay, and then we're going to go from there. So I'm going to add 4x to each side to get rid of the 4x there. That'll get me, so I'll add 4x right here. It's going to get me x squared plus 3x equals 18. Okay, I still want 0 over here, so now I'm going to subtract 18 from each side. So I'll get x squared plus 3x minus 18 equals 0. Now I'm good to go to factor. Okay, x here and there. The two numbers are going to multiply together to get 18, so let's get those cranked out here. I'm looking for a pair that subtracts to get 3. That'd be 3 and 6. So I'll put 3 and 6, and then I have to decide which one gets the negative sign. One of them has to have a negative because they're multiplying together to get 18. Who gets the negative sign, so when we add them together, we get positive 3. Well, the only way for that to happen is for that one to be positive and that one to be negative. Okay? Now, if this were 0, that makes x 3. If this were 0, x is negative 6. Now you've found both solutions. Let's do another one. Okay. With this one, I'm going to go ahead and do these 2 steps in your head here. I'm going to add x to each side. Okay? So that's going to give me x squared minus 7x, because negative 8x plus 1x is negative 7x. And then I'm going to add 9 to each side, so that gets me negative 18. Negative 27 plus 9 is negative 18. Now, the 2 numbers I'm looking for on the outside are going to have to multiply together to give 18. Same ones we had before. But now I'm looking for a pair that subtracts to get 9. That'd be, subtracts to get 7. So that'd be 2 and 9. And who gets the negative sign so that when they add together to get negative 7, well, the only way for that to happen is for this one to be positive 2 and that one to be negative 9, so they add together to get negative 7. Now you know that x is negative 2 and positive 9. Okay, there's our solutions. Okay. So when you look at one like this, first of all, we'll get the thing cleaned up, and I'm going to do that in your head here. I'm going to add 5x to each side, so that's going to give you 5x. I'm going to add 10 to each side, that's going to get you negative 4 equals 0. Well, we've got a bit of a problem now. We no longer have a 1 here, so we need to use the other technique for doing this. You may remember what that is. You've got notes about it, but let's take a look here. 6 times 4 is 24. So I'll write out all the factor pairs, 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. I'm looking for a pair that subtracts to get 5. That's 3 and 8. And we're going to take 5x and split it up into 3x and 8x. Well, the only way for that to happen would be if this was negative 3 and that would be positive 8. Okay, so those combine together to get 5x. We'll bring down the other things in the equation. We've done this before. And now we'll take a look at just the first 2 terms here, and we'll factor out the biggest thing we can. That's going to be a 3 and an x. And let's write what's left over. There'll be a 2x here, because 3x times 2x is 6x squared. And it's going to be negative. What do you need to multiply right here by 3x to get 3x? Well, that's a 1. Okay. Now we'll take a look at the second 2 and factor out the biggest thing we can from there. That's going to be 4. And hopefully I'm going to get 2x minus 1. So 4 times 2x is 8x. Check. Minus 1. 4 times negative 1 is negative 4. Check. We're good to go. Last thing we'll do is say, all right, let's factor out a 2x minus 1 from each of these things. And we're left over with a 3x plus 4 equals 0. Well, now we've got 2 things multiplying together to get 0, but it's not quite as plain what x is. It's not going to be positive 1, because 2 times positive 1 minus 1 isn't 0. So what I encourage you to do is just say, look, 2x minus 1 is supposed to equal 0. Now solve for x and find out. So I added 1 to each side. Now I'll divide by 2, so x is 1/2. Okay? Over here, 3x plus 4 is supposed to equal 0. So we'll solve for x here. Subtract 4 from each side, divide by 3, we'll get x equals negative 4/3. So there are your 2 solutions. Okay, let's do another one. Okay. I'm going to add 9x to each side to get 0 over here, so that's going to be 5x squared. Negative 1 plus 9 is positive 8x minus 4 equals 0. We're going to have to use our fancier technique, because this is not 1. So we'll take 5 times 4 and get 20. Write the factor pairs. Okay, that's all of them. We're looking for a pair that subtracts to get 8. Well, that'd be 2 and 10. Okay, so we'll take 8x and split it up into 2x and 10x. They're not going to add together to get 8 unless one of them is negative. The only way for that to happen is for that one to be negative and that one to be positive. We'll bring everything else down. And we'll say, what's the biggest thing I can factor out of these 2 things here? Well, just an x. And I'll have 5x minus 2. What's the biggest thing I can factor out of these 2 things? Well, that's going to be a positive 2. And what's left over? 5x minus 2 again. Okay? So that tells us we're probably on the right track. So we're going to factor out a 5x minus 2, from each of these things, and we'll have an x left over from here and a plus 2 left over from there. And now, what does it take to make this 0? Well, let's find out. 5x minus 2 equals 0. If we add 2 to each side, and then divide by 5, we'll get x equals 2/5. Okay? Over here, what's it take to make this 0? X equals -2. So now you got your two solutions, 2/5 and -2. Okay, probably have time for one more. I'm going to subtract 6x from each side, so that's going to give me 6x squared. 1x minus 6x is -5x plus 1. Okay, equals 0. Well, 6 times 1, that's 6. Factor pairs are 1 and 6, and 2 and 3. Which pair adds together to get 5? Well, which pair adds together to get 5? That's going to be 2 and 3 right here. So we'll take 5x and split it up into 2x and 3x. Unfortunately, they need to add together to get -5, so we'll give them each a negative sign. That'll do it. -2 minus 3 is going to give you -5. And we'll bring the other things down for the ride here. And once again, we'll take a look at what's the biggest thing we can factor out of these two? Well, I can factor out a 2 and an x, and let's see what we're left over with. 2 times what is 6? That's 3. X times another x gets me my x squared. Okay, and then when I divide out 2x, when I divide 2x by 2x, I get a -1. That's another way to look at that. Is saying, okay, I'm taking this thing and dividing by that, so what's left over? Okay. Over here, this negative sign warns me, hey, always take out a negative if I see a negative right there. Okay, and then what's the biggest thing I can take out of each of these things? Well, they really don't have anything in common other than 1. Okay, I got to take something out. So what's left over here? -1 times what gets you -3x? Well, 3x. -1 times what gets you +1? Well, -1. That's good because these two things right there and there are supposed to match, and they do. So I'll factor that out, 3x minus 1 and 2x minus 1 left over. Okay. Now, what does it take to make this equal to 0? Well, by now you may see a pattern and say, okay, look, it's x equals 1/3, but let's write it out. 3x minus 1 is supposed to equal 0. Add 1 to each side, you get 3x equals 1. Divide by 3, and you get x equals 1/3. Over here, 2x minus 1 is supposed to equal 0. So add 1 to each side, you get 2x equals 1. And divide by 2, you get x equals 1/2. So my two solutions are 1/3 and 1/2. Okay? That ought to be a pretty good introduction to how to solve a quadratic equation using factoring, both the ones that are simple, where they have just a plain x squared here, and ones that are more complex, where they have something other than 1 on the x squared term. All right.